The night Princess Diana secretly visited Neverland Ranch, she whispered something to Michael that made him cry in front of 50 guests. What she told him would change how the King of Pop saw his entire life. This isn't just about two icons meeting. It's about the moment when the most famous woman in the world gave the most famous man in the world permission to be human. June 14th, 1988. While the world slept, a convoy of unmarked black cars wound through the hills of Santa Barbara County. No press, no photographers, no royal protocol. Just Princess Diana, escaping the suffocating walls of Kensington Palace for one night of freedom at the most magical place on earth. But what happened that night between two of the world's most isolated souls would remain their secret for decades, until now. The arrangement had taken months to orchestrate. Elizabeth Taylor, during a private dinner with Diana in London, mentioned her close friendship with Michael Jackson. Diana had confided about feeling trapped in her royal life, struggling with her crumbling marriage to Prince Charles, and desperately needing to connect with someone who understood the unique pressures of global fame. Elizabeth immediately thought of Michael, who was battling similar feelings of isolation despite his massive success. When Elizabeth suggested they meet, Diana's eyes lit up for the first time in months. The logistics were nightmarish. Diana's personal secretary, Patrick Jeffson, worked through back channels with Michael's security team to ensure complete privacy. Diana's official schedule showed her attending a private dinner in London, while Michael cleared his calendar, telling his staff he needed a quiet evening at home. The deception was necessary because both knew that if word leaked, it would become a media circus that would destroy the very intimacy they desperately needed. For weeks leading up to the visit, Michael had been struggling with his own demons. The massive success of the Bad album had brought him to new heights of fame, but also new depths of isolation. He'd been seeing a therapist quietly, Dr. Eugene Landy, who had been helping him understand the difference between Michael Jackson, the performer, and Michael Jackson, the person. When Diana's people reached out, Dr. Landy encouraged the meeting, seeing it as potentially therapeutic for both parties. Michael Jackson was pacing nervously in the main house at Neverland Ranch, adjusting his black fedora for the 10th time in 5 minutes. He'd changed outfits 3 times, finally settling on his favorite black shirt with silver detailing and his signature white glove. He'd met presidents, performed for royalty, broken every record imaginable, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the people's princess was coming to see him, not as the King of Pop, but as Michael the Man. Diana had reached out through Elizabeth Taylor, asking for a private meeting away from the circus that followed both their lives. She'd been dealing with the collapse of her marriage, the relentless media scrutiny, and the suffocating expectations of royal duty. Michael understood that prison better than anyone, having lived in a similar goldfish bowl since he was 5 years old. The guest list that evening was intimate, just 50 of Michael's closest friends and collaborators. Quincy Jones was there, along with Elizabeth Taylor, who had been instrumental in arranging the meeting, Macaulay Culkin's family, and several children from the local hospital whom Michael regularly hosted. Diana had specifically requested that children be present, saying she needed to remember what pure joy looked like, away from the calculated interactions that dominated her royal life. When Diana's car pulled through the gates of Neverland at 9:47 p.m., something magical happened. The woman who stepped out wasn't the perfectly polished princess the world knew. Her hair was slightly tousled from the long drive. She wore a simple cream-colored dress instead of designer gowns. And for the first time in months, she was smiling genuinely. Michael walked out to greet her, and witnesses later said the moment their eyes met, it was like watching two caged birds recognize each other. There was an instant understanding, a recognition of shared pain that needed no words. They embraced not as celebrities, but as two human beings who had forgotten what it felt like to be themselves. As they walked toward the house, Diana paused, looking around at the whimsical landscape of Neverland with wide eyes that seemed to be seeing magic for the first time in years. The fairy lights twinkling in the trees like earthbound stars, the distant sounds of carousel music drifting through the evening air, the carefully manicured gardens that looked like something from a children's storybook brought tears to her eyes. "It's like stepping into a fairy tale," she said softly, her voice carrying a mixture of wonder and profound sadness that Michael immediately recognized in his own soul. I can see why you built this place. Sometimes we need somewhere that the real world can't touch, don't we? Somewhere we can remember what it felt like to believe in magic. Michael nodded, understanding immediately what she meant with a clarity that surprised him. He explained how every single detail of Neverland had been meticulously designed to recreate the childhood wonder he'd never been allowed to experience, but also how it had gradually become his sanctuary from a world that demanded absolute perfection from him every moment of every day, never allowing him to simply be human. The evening began with Michael giving Diana a private tour of Neverland. As they walked through the amusement park, Diana laughing like a schoolgirl as Michael explained how he designed each ride to capture the wonder he'd missed in his own childhood. She began sharing stories of her own lost innocence. She told him about being thrust into the spotlight at 19, how she'd gone from being a shy kindergarten teacher to the most photographed woman in the world overnight. She described the brutal protocol lessons, the constant criticism, the way every gesture was analyzed by the press and royal family. But it was when they reached the zoo that something shifted. Standing before the elephant enclosure, Diana suddenly became quiet. Michael noticed tears forming in her eyes and gently asked what was wrong. That's when Diana shared something she'd never told anyone. She spoke about feeling like an animal in a zoo herself, constantly watched, photographed, expected to perform on command. She talked about how Charles had once told her that her only job was to be seen and not heard, to smile and wave and produce airs. Michael felt his heart breaking as he recognized his own pain in her words. Michael shared his own zoo analogy, describing how he felt like a rare specimen that people paid to see perform, but never really wanted to know as a person. He told her about the loneliness of being surrounded by people who only saw him as a source of entertainment, never as someone with his own needs, fears, and dreams. As they stood there watching the elephants care for each other with gentle tenderness, both realized they'd found someone who truly understood the unique isolation that came with global fame. As they continued walking, Diana began opening up about the deeper loneliness of being a global icon. She described waking up each morning to a schedule planned by others, wearing clothes chosen by others, attending events that meant nothing to her personally. She talked about how she'd lost herself somewhere between being Lady Diana Spencer and becoming Princess Diana, how she sometimes couldn't remember who she really was underneath all the expectations. Michael listened intently, occasionally squeezing her hand when her voice broke. He understood every word because he'd lived every emotion she was describing. Michael told her about his own morning routine, how he often stood in front of the mirror practicing being Michael Jackson before facing the day, putting on the persona like armor. He described the crushing weight of knowing that millions of people thought they loved him, but they only loved the version of him they saw on stage. The real Michael, with his insecurities and fears, felt invisible to the world. When they returned to the main house, the 50 carefully selected guests were gathered in Michael's living room, a space that managed to feel both luxurious and intimately comfortable, filled with carefully chosen antiques, hundreds of family photos that told the story of his life, and memorabilia from his extraordinary career, but also deeply personal touches that revealed his true personality. Books on child psychology and development, art supplies scattered on side tables from his private creative sessions, and dozens of framed photos of him with sick children he'd visited privately, away from any cameras or publicity. Diana immediately gravitated toward the children present, sitting cross-legged on the floor with them, without any regard for her expensive dress or royal protocol, asking about their dreams and fears with the kind of genuine, focused interest that made each child feel like the most important person in the room. Michael watched her transform before his eyes, seeing glimpses of the real Diana behind the carefully maintained royal facade, the natural kindergarten teacher who'd fallen in love with helping children learn and grow and discover their own unlimited potential. What struck him most was how effortlessly she connected with them, how her entire demeanor changed when she was simply being herself rather than performing the role of princess. During dinner, conversation flowed easily. Diana asked Michael about his music, his inspiration, his hopes for the future, but she also asked about the parts of his life the public never saw, the moments when he felt most himself. Michael found himself opening up in ways he rarely did, He told her about his secret visits to hospitals, how he'd sometimes drive around Los Angeles late at night just to feel anonymous, how he'd written some of his most personal songs in the middle of the night when he thought no one was listening. Diana shared her own secret rebellions, the times she'd snuck out of Kensington Palace just to walk through Hyde Park like a normal person, her clandestine visits to homeless shelters where she could help people without photographers documenting her every move. What was remarkable to the other guests was watching two people who were accustomed to being the center of attention learn to simply be present with each other. As the evening progressed, something beautiful began happening. Diana started to relax in a way none of the guests had ever seen. She laughed at Michael's jokes, joined the children in singing along to his songs, and even attempted a moonwalk, much to everyone's delight. But Michael was studying her carefully, seeing past the laughter to the pain she was carrying. He recognized the performance because he'd been giving the same one his entire life. Around midnight, as guests began to leave, Diana and Michael found themselves alone on the terrace overlooking the ranch. The silence between them was comfortable, the kind that exists between people who truly understand each other. That's when Diana asked the question that changed everything. She looked at Michael and said, "When was the last time you did something just because it made you happy, not because it was expected of you?" Michael was quiet for a long moment, realizing he couldn't remember. Diana nodded knowingly. "I can't remember either. We've both become prisoners of our own success." What happened next would haunt and heal Michael for the rest of his life. Diana took his hands and looked directly into his eyes, and with the gentle authority of someone who had learned hard truths about life, she said 7 words that would echo in Michael's mind forever. "You have permission to disappoint them, Michael." Those words hit him like a physical blow. Permission to disappoint, permission to say no, permission to choose his own happiness over others' expectations. No one had ever given him that permission before. Not his father, not Motown, not his managers, not his advisors. But here was Diana, someone who understood the weight of the world's expectations, giving him something he'd never had: permission to be human. Michael broke down crying right there on the terrace, and Diana held him as years of suppressed emotion poured out. He cried for the childhood he'd lost, for the choices he'd never been allowed to make, for the person he might have been if he'd had the courage to disappoint people. Diana cried too, for similar losses, for roads not taken, for the authentic selves they'd both buried under layers of public expectation. But Diana wasn't finished. She pulled back and looked at Michael seriously. "Promise me something. Promise me you'll start making choices for Michael Jackson the man, not Michael Jackson the brand. Promise me you'll remember that disappointing others is sometimes the only way to stop disappointing yourself." Michael promised, though neither of them knew how difficult that promise would be to keep. As Diana prepared to leave around 2 a.m., she gave Michael a small, wrapped gift. Inside was a simple silver bracelet with an inscription, "To thine own self be true, Diana." She explained that it was a reminder that beneath all the titles, expectations, and public personas, they were both just human beings deserving of happiness and authenticity. Michael put it on immediately and wore it for the rest of his life. The impact of that conversation began showing immediately. Within weeks, Michael started making changes that shocked the music industry. He began saying no to projects that didn't inspire him, spending more unscheduled time with children, and most importantly, he continued therapy to work through the trauma of growing up in the spotlight. Diana had given him more than permission to disappoint others. She'd given him permission to heal. Diana and Michael maintained a private friendship for years, exchanging letters and occasional phone calls. Diana would update him on her humanitarian work and her struggles with the royal family, while Michael shared his journey toward emotional healing and his growing commitment to helping children. When Diana died in 1997, Michael was devastated. He'd lost one of the few people who truly understood the unique loneliness of being a global icon. At Diana's funeral, which Michael attended privately, he wore the silver bracelet she'd given him. Later, he would tell close friends that Diana had saved his life that night at Neverland by giving him permission to choose himself. The conversation they had about disappointment and authenticity became a cornerstone of his personal philosophy. Today, 35 years later, the impact of that secret meeting continues to ripple through both their legacies. Michael's later humanitarian work, his dedication to children's causes, and his efforts to maintain some semblance of normal life can all be traced back to the permission Diana gave him that night. Similarly, Diana's later rebellions against royal protocol, her humanitarian missions, and her determination to raise her sons with more freedom were influenced by her realization that disappointing the establishment was sometimes necessary for authentic living. The story of Michael Jackson and Princess Diana's secret meeting reminds us that even the most famous, most watched, most celebrated people in the world are fundamentally human beings seeking connection, understanding, and permission to be themselves. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone isn't advice or solutions, but simply the permission to stop performing and start living. Diana gave Michael that gift, and in doing so, she changed not just his life, but the lives of countless others he would go on to help and inspire. The silver bracelet Diana gave Michael was found among his personal effects at Neverland Ranch after his death in 2009. Engraved on the inside in Michael's handwriting were the words, "She gave me permission to be human." That bracelet now sits in a private collection, a tangible reminder of the night two icons found each other in their loneliness and gave each other the gift of authentic human connection. Their secret meeting proves that sometimes the most important conversations happen away from cameras, away from crowds, away from the expectations of the world. Sometimes two people just need to sit together in the darkness and give each other permission to stop being who everyone else needs them to be and start being who they really are. That's exactly what happened the night Princess Diana visited Neverland Ranch, and the world is better for it, even if most people never knew it happened.